Hello everyone, my name is Valerie Molay and I work for the National Youth Council of Ireland, and I'll let Jamie introduce himself too.
Hello everybody, my name is Jamie Gorman. And is this one on? Oh, it is, yeah. Jamie Gorman, and I work for Maynooth University in Ireland. So today we're here to present the sort of tentative findings of a collaborative inquiry process between some researchers in Maynooth University and the staff of the National Youth Council's Global Youthwork team. And what we were looking to do in this study is to identify insights from the NYCI's work that are of relevance to youth work, practice and youth policy making more broadly when it comes to the issue of climate justice. And our methodology, as I said, was collaborative inquiry, which is a sort of well-established professional peer-to-peer research process used often in educational and organizational settings, and prioritizes reflection, dialogue, exchange in exploring practice in a collegial environment. So to date, we've conducted 2 collaborative inquiry workshops and individual one-on-one interviews between Youth Council staff and the researchers. So that's what we're going to speak to you about today.
Just before we start, actually, you will see on your tables, we left you one of the products of the Future Generation project, just to give you a flavor of what the project was about, as we will be speaking also a lot about that. But we also thought it would be nice to start with some context, and just to let you guys know, understand, like, what does youth work actually mean in the context of Ireland. So in Ireland, really, the youth work has a statutory recognition through the Youthwork Act of 2001. It really defines youth work as a planned program of education designed for the purpose of aiding and enhancing personal and social development of young people through the voluntary involvement which is complementary to the formal academic, vocational education and training provided primarily by voluntary youth work organization. So we at the National Youth Council of Ireland, we really believe in that specific voluntary participation of young people. So it's different than schools in a way where young people are not told or forced to go to school or told that you have to, but in youth work setting, they're voluntarily coming. So that difference also makes is important in the interaction then with the young people. So also, the National Youth Council, we represent about 380 young people in Ireland. So we have a broader membership in terms of youth work in Ireland as such. So again, before we move on to that understanding of youth work, 2 of the purpose of youth work that we really, we have about 7 of them on our webpage, but 2 that I thought was very, that was at the core of our project, Future Generation, was that understanding that youth work is about giving young people the voice to become active in decision making in things that matters to their life. And that, again, the other understanding is about supporting young people to become active citizens in our society as such. So those are the 2 major points. That's the youth work part of things, but it's also nice to understand the context of like Irish climate policy, to understand the Irish climate movement, the youth movement also in Ireland. So I did a little collection of a newspaper because I think it's actually quite fascinating. It tells you all you kind of need to know. So as you see, laggard is a word that comes very much when it comes to Irish climate policy for a very, very long time. Some may still argue that we're still there. We were known and somehow proud to be laggard in Europe in terms of climate policy. What really that means is unless we were told what to do, we didn't do it. And even when we were told what to do, we sometimes didn't do it until punishment was kind of at our doorstep. But the people of Ireland demanded more, right? So this is where the youth movement come into practice in shaping Irish policy. So here again, I nicely put, we put collection of movement because it's so important. So as you can see, so this is actually the youth assembly that happened in Ireland in 2019, where young people actually took over the parliament and came out with a document about what needs to happen in terms of climate. But then there was also the big march, like the youth strikers, like Friday for Future, SCAN, being part of this movement as such to bring about change in Ireland. But there wasn't just young people themselves, there was also the broader climate movement made an impact. And I'd like to talk about the shift that happened a couple of years ago when litigation approach actually is what brought us what we can say a more progressive climate policy in Ireland. So the Climate Case Ireland is only the second in the world where the highest court of the country basically decided that the government policy on climate change or approach to climate change was inadequate in terms of their legal obligation. So forcing the government actually to do something better. So that led us then to this lovely roadmap to carbon neutrality. I mean, in itself, the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act of 2021, as you can see, it's very new, as such, is progressive in itself. It's probably one, I think researchers have argued that it is one of the more progressive climate policy out there in the world. However, if we remember back in terms of Ireland being a climate laggard for quite a long time, so yes, we may be progressive in our law, but it's still not pushing the boundary to basically bring us back to where we were. So as an environmentalist, I'm probably going to argue for much more than what we have, but we can work with what we have at the moment as such. So this is in itself a result of the climate movement, including the youth movement as such. Yeah, we just thought we should start with that in terms of context, so you know what Youthwork means, but also what the climate movement or the climate policy setting in Ireland is.
So then, what's the challenge for youth workers in all of this? And as Lasse has pointed out, since 2018, young people across Europe, including in Ireland, have been taking to the streets in huge numbers to protest at the failures of adult systems of climate governance, which youth argue are too slow, are willfully ignorant, or potentially even captured by the interests of the fossil fuel industry and others. Furthermore, we argue that there are significant challenges to parity of esteem in climate governance structures, meaning that marginalized and non-elite groups often face significant difficulties in being seen, being heard, and having an impact in outcomes in terms of climate policy making and in spaces such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, those global spaces. So this is a particular challenge for young people because our societies are profoundly adultist, which means that there's systemic discrimination and disempowerment of children through policies, practices, and actions which privilege adults and limit children's agency, autonomy, and subjectivity. And we see that in terms of the strikes, where we have school principals arguing that, yes, it's a worthy cause, but no, you can't engage in political action because you're children. And when it comes to climate governance, young people exist within a subordinate relationship to the dominant managerialist, technocratic, scientific climate governance frameworks. They don't have the expertise to be taken seriously in those spaces. And such governance structures tend to privilege expert knowledge that further limits young people's agency and recognition of their rights. And all of this, we suggest, is one of the key reasons why young people have taken to the streets in such great numbers. And the core youth strategy of the strike has been used to collectively raise their voices and attempt to address this imbalance of power. So in terms of the identity conflict and the solidarity dilemma that Lasse pointed to, I think we can put our hands up and say we fall within the emancipatory tradition. And for us, the key question for the youth sector is then, how do we as youth workers and youth policy makers stand with young people to equalize those hierarchies, to address the power asymmetries and to support their voices to be heard in decision making. So when we look to the literature on this, there's a couple of emerging solutions and perspectives that we've been inspired by and draw on in our work. And research scholarship has really sought to address this intergenerational question of climate justice. So we have Josephson and Wall, who speak about empowered inclusion, which they define as interdependent engagement with lived experiences of difference in ways that challenge and transform shared global norms and practices, and in which all persons and groups are actively empowered to transform global power relations based on shared responsiveness to lived experiences of difference. So it's this question of how do we support and include and manage difference in civil society, in debate, in dialogue, recognizing it and addressing barriers to inclusion. So it's empowered inclusion. And crucially, they recognize the importance of interdependence. So it's not that young people should be favored over adults or adults over young people, but that through an interdependent relationship, we can move forward through dialogue. A second important concept that we've drawn on is inclusive orchestration, which has been developed by Harriet Chu and other colleagues working to study the UNFCCC process, and in particular the YUNGO, the youth constituency within the UN processes. And they've developed a concept which they describe as inclusive orchestration, which refers to governance through coordination and collaboration between states and non-state actors, as with the UNFCCC and its constituency groups, involving ongoing management of policy initiatives, policy initiative implementation, with the explicit purpose of balancing power dynamics and supporting weaker partners. And we also draw inspiration from the Finnish Utopia study and others such as Karen O'Brien's study that's been referenced by Lasse already, and their typology of dissent as dutiful, disruptive and dangerous. But for the purposes of this study, we've picked out empowered inclusion and inclusive, or this presentation, we've picked out these to speak about. So what are the commonalities between all of these approaches that are emerging in the literature? Well, there's a couple of key things that the literature suggests we need to be addressing in terms of policy, in terms of institutions, and in terms of culture in order to rebalance these power asymmetries in youth participation and climate governance. The first is to recognize the multi-scalar and multifaceted nature of the crisis, that the impacts of climate change are being felt on many different fronts and in many different levels of governance. That we need to acknowledge the deep interdependence of humans with one another and between species. We need to support a diversity of actors and a plurality of voices, through inclusive structures, capacity building and resource prioritization. So this is the point of inclusive orchestration, that we don't just start with saying that everybody's welcome, but we actually work to proactively address the barriers to inclusion. Recognizing and responding to adultism and striving for equity and the equalization of hierarchies between young people and adults. And then finally giving visibility to youth who are expressing alternative values and solutions, and recognizing those spaces as incubators of new norms and incubators for new democratic practices. So, with that, I'll hand back over to Valerie to tell us a bit about the Future Generations project itself.
Yeah. So it's a little bit with all of that in mind, what you're seeing in terms of the different approaches. So we kind of look at the Future Generation itself, the project. So realistically, where did the project even come from and how did this start? So the Future Generation Climate Justice project, it came into existence based on the creation of a climate justice fund that the government, basically the Department of Children, put in place to support youth organization, to support young people in their climate engagement as such. So the idea, once again, I have two pictures there to really showcase how did it come about. So why did the department suddenly decide to create a fund that they call Climate Justice? It was actually based on the first ever UN Youth Summit on climate justice. So our ministers and the government participated at that. And at the time, Ireland also had a role to play in terms of the youth engagement side of the climate summit, where they brought about what we call the Climate Justice Pledge, or Kwangesh, actually it's called. And what they did as a country, we wrote a pledge that said that government had to support young people to be included in climate movement and in climate policy or the development of climate solution. So we had to live up to what we actually said we were going to do. So every country that is signed up to it, I think if I'm not mistaken, there's about 53 countries in the world that are signed up to this pledge. So climate activists in Ireland, youth climate activists, use that actually as a way to ask for more support from them. Again, I think it's really important to nail down the idea that it came from the youth movement, but the youth movement also gave it the idea of the climate justice element to it. Because we know that when it comes to the climate movement, we can talk about climate and just focus on the environmental side of things. But what the youth movement is very much screaming and shouting about is the combination of the environmental issue with social justice issue. So it was only fair that the fund will focus on climate justice rather than climate change itself as such, to respond to that need from young people. So the Climate Justice Future Generation project is actually a funded project of that Climate Justice Fund that came into existence for youth organization in Ireland. So there is a specific focus, again, that we at the National Youth Council of Ireland decided to take with our 5 partners, and you'll understand why we had 5 partners into a consortium rather than doing it ourselves. So the focus was, from the get-go, we understood the climate crisis to be a systemic problem rather than just one that is of an environmental issue. So recognizing that the system to which, the climate crisis is a symptom of an unsustainable economic and political system, whether it is democratic deficit or whether it is overconsumption, and all of that are playing a part, and all the other social justice issues that exist will part and parcel be affected by how we solve climate. So for example, climate solution, it's not enough that we come up with carbon neutrality when we're not making sure that carbon neutrality in Europe is not just enough when other parts of the world, such as the Pacific Islands, are disappearing. So we need to have that justice element and recognizing that the climate crisis is a broader problem. So that was a focus for us when we were starting this project. But there was also this understanding about, it became very clear to us that there was a demographic trend related to class, race, educational level that could be identified within the climate movement. So I think there is actually a research also from the Council of Europe that actually looks back at the education level of climate strikers. So although the gender was not all, I think it was like 70% women, but most of them also, their background where the parents were highly educated, right? So even in Ireland, we could already see that the majority of people young people that were speaking about the climate were also coming from a specific group. And what that told us is that not all young people's voices were equally being heard on the topic, or not all young people were interacting in the topic. So we made it our mission to include basically the voice that we thought were being left out based on our membership. So in the context of Ireland, if anybody will know a little bit when it comes to Ireland and climate change, we have a very strong correlation between the agricultural sector, because it's one of our biggest emitters, and climate change. So very often, young farmers were not giving the voice to speak, or whenever they were mentioned in news or news outlet or stuff, it was always related to you're the bad people. So we wanted to give young people, young farmers, the ability to come in with other groups and actually speak to the matter from their point of view as such. But we also wanted we also focused on including the voices of rural Ireland youth, because once again, it was a marginalized voice, or a voice that wasn't super heard in terms of the climate movement. And we also included marginalized or low socioeconomic background young people. So we had groups from inner Dublin city who wouldn't necessarily have engaged with climate change before. But we also included our fifth partner was or the Irish indigenous group, so the traveller community. So we also included young travellers in our conversation. So that gives us Macron Farmer as our young farmers partner. We had Spear 17 and Swan Youth Service covering the inner Dublin city perspective, and then we have YMCA covering the rural Ireland, and then Involve Mead, who was covering the traveling young people perspective as such. So in terms of why we focused, why that was our focus, that is the reason, because we were really trying to get a little bit what Jamie was talking about. It's not enough to just talk that we want it to be equal. We actually have to physically create structures that makes it inclusive. So we went out looking for young people that were missing to come on board with the project. But another thing about the future generation approach was, so from the get-go, we wanted to embed climate justice within the organization. So it wasn't enough for us to work with young people, for them to understand what climate justice is, or for them to take action. But we wanted to be more sustainable, and the way to make it more sustainable, we believe, was to make sure that it was embedded in the organization. And one way to embed the practice or the principles of climate justice was to make sure that we were working with young people, youth workers, but also the head of organization, so the management sector. So within, actually, if you look through your resource, we actually have almost a list of like, how do you participate from those three pillars? How do you then contribute to the embedment of the project? But that also created this fascinating dynamic, because when we had trainings, capacity building, when we had conversation, we had it within those three pillars. So young people were automatically at the same standpoint as youth workers, as managers, both learning at the same time, making decision about the project all together. And we always talk about this fascinating, if you guys have time to look at our website, we had one of the action that young people took was a webinar that they organized called "Can Everybody Actually Afford to Be Green?", where the conversation started very much about affordability in terms of money, but then very quickly moved on from that to people actually starting asking questions, but do people have the mind space to even think about being green in our community? What stops us from even thinking beyond? So the affordability was monetary, to time, to space in mind. So it was a quite fascinating conversation, and I think that came about because the young people were determining the topics, but they were also listening and interacting with youth workers and the management all at the same time, all at the same level in terms of their inputs. But we also use global youth work methodology very much at the core of this project, which meant then for us it was super important to start where young people were at and not actually trying to make them what they were not. So again, climate justice approach allowed us to make such an easier connection. So if a young person wasn't actually super interested in the environmental side or didn't understand it, which sometimes we heard many times, a young person being like, well, I'm not supposed to know about climate change, or society has taught me that climate change is not something that I should care about. We heard that comment from our young people from the traveling community, for example. It's for the rich kids that can talk about and things like that. But then tapping into another side of their culture or another social justice issue that they face and connecting it to how it will be impacted with climate change or where it sits within climate justice. That was a nice way to kind of make the connection for them to see how important the project was overall. So starting where young people were, we also did a lot of capacity building for all the 3 pillars, whether it was training, advocacy, media. We gave them the tools to support their understanding, but also to use those understanding to turn into something which led to the likes of the resource that you have in front of you, or the webinars about can everyone afford to be green. But the project was also beyond awareness raising to actually pushing young people to taking action. So each group actually took an action or did something based on the process to which they had. So we had lovely murals where young people decorated a mural as an information, not just for their youth center, but also to impact and bring about their community, which then led to conversation of like, so one of the youth groups had, the youth center is in a building with other NGOs. So they started a process of thinking, what can we do about recycling how come in this area we don't get recycling bin? Is it because we're perceived not to be capable of using recycling properly? And if that's the case, why? So started really poignant questions there with the broader society, which is exactly what we intended with the approach. But also another action project that was done and still exists is the Sustainable Sleepover Club. I would really encourage you guys to listen to it if you can, where young people actually took the concept of a sleepover club, and where instead of gathering to talk and watch movies, they actually gathered to talk about the SDGs and then have guest speakers and then expand on that question of climate justice within those SDGs and stuff. So that's a little bit about that. Okay, perfect.
So Valerie has given us a great flavour, I think, of the work of the Youth Council in this area, and coming from the university and not from the Youth Council, I think I can say, personally, we've been very privileged to be involved in this project and learn from the work that they're doing, and very excited by the approach they've taken to trashing out some of these questions for youth work in practice and bringing alive some of these concepts, such as empowered inclusion and inclusive orchestration. But there's some things that we can say, I suppose, about the model generally, and there's still some questions, of course, that remain and challenges that we continue to face moving forward. So looking at it in its broad terms, and apologies to those who are watching this on the live stream who probably can't see the slides, we can identify 3 elements of the project that are really important for supporting empowered inclusion. So we have pluralistic participation of young people, and actually I can't read it here, so I'll have to turn around, which breaks down into two elements. So firstly, as Valerie mentioned, building a diverse consortium of collaborators, really from the outset looking to identify who isn't included in the conversation around climate justice, which young people, and how do we reach out to the organisations that are working with those young people to begin to build a bridge towards their participation. Secondly, then, engaging youth on their terms. Again, as Valerie mentioned, the importance of starting where young people are at and going through that youth work process with them, identifying the themes which are relevant and real for them in their lives, and beginning to work with them from that point as a start. Then we have building of youth sector capacity, and this has 3 elements that we consider to be important. So supporting young people on their journeys towards action, beginning with starting where they're at, and supporting them through education, training, and resource support to begin to take action on climate justice in whichever way makes sense to them in their own lives and contexts. So, again, as Valerie mentioned, the different individual consortium partners took action with their young people in a variety of different ways. Then we have development of worker capacity, and as Andreas mentioned in his opening comments, you know, that there is in Ireland also a hesitancy around engaging on this topic from youth workers who maybe question the relevance or the importance of it to their practice, and this is something that the team in the Youth Council grappled with in their engagement with youth workers. But going back, as Valerie did at the start, to the purpose of youth work, at least as we define it in Ireland, the Youth Council was really making the case that this is an important issue for young people's participation, their active citizenship and their involvement in decisions which affect their lives. Thirdly, then, in terms of building capacity in the sector, and the previous diagram, I think, illustrated this really well, the Youth Council took an ecosystems approach to both within the partner organisations working with young people, youth workers and management, to working across the sector between youth policymakers, funding bodies and organisations, delivery organisations and researchers. So that ecosystems approach towards bringing people together in dialogue to embed these practices and this approach into the sector more fully and completely. And then thirdly, we have the importance of collective decision making. So within the projects, young people being involved. Within the Future Generations project, young people being involved at every stage on the steering group, supporting young people to be involved in their own organisations and in dialogue with workers and with management to develop global youth work policies or climate justice policies for the organisation. And then moving out towards governance structures connecting young people to policy spaces. And this is where it's really still a work in progress, I think. And although there was some success or there has been some success in terms of young people being facilitated to engage in climate governance in Ireland, there's still a long way to go. And there really remains significant, I think, challenges in this regard. I'll just find my notes on that. Yeah, so I suppose the question that remains for us is how much can the youth sector be responsible for supporting youth participation in climate governance when it's a non-state actor and or broadly non-state actor, and so we recognise the importance of states, and in the Irish context, the Irish government, of course, putting in place structures that meaningfully engage youth in collective decision making and connecting them to policy making spaces. And young people, we find in Ireland at least, are still acting, still attempting to be heard within adult structures of governance, still invited into spaces, but their views are not reflected in policy outcomes. And we don't feel this is a failure of the young people, that the young people need to improve their participation or their methods of acting, but rather we argue that a culture shift is required amongst adults to move beyond youth washing of climate governance towards more empowered inclusion of young people in those structures. And so for us, we would say the time for hesitation is over, and that for those of us who are adults in the youth sector, we argue that we must start to be bold, to take responsibility, and to help to dismantle that adultist culture and structures in climate governance so that young people's participation is effective and seen in the outcomes of climate governance. Thank you.
Yes. Thanks, Valerie. Thanks, Jamie. You can stay still a little bit. Maybe we have 2 questions maybe for you from the audience. I think while you're thinking what to ask Valerie and Jamie, I really wanted to congratulate you actually for bringing actually the systemic approach into dealing with systemic issues. Probably that's the way to go. Questions to Valerie and Jamie. Thoughts? Microphones are on the table. If not, I bring the microphone to you, so don't worry. Yes, Andreas.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, I mean, it seems like you're still quite early in the process of consultation and talking and things, and I'm wondering, like, in how far are the policy changes that you're looking at with the young people and the different actors involved? They're probably not just affecting youth policy, but different fields of policy, and how is the interaction with those different resorts and those different policy areas? And is there already an indication towards what kind of suggestions or changes the young people and the different actors involved are aiming at in the youth field and in other fields?
Yeah, I think definitely what young people are asking for is not just related to climate change itself, but it's a broader structural change that they're asking. And I think one of them would respond to that democratic deficit to begin with, where they could be at the table to actually make contribution or to have a sort of level of dialogue. So I always refer to the 4 level of participation that you can basically sort of brand or talk about youth participation in those levels, where it's like information giving, consultation, decision making, like partnership, or the like dialogue, and then partnership. And I think you will hear very often that one of the major things that young people are asking for is, first of all, to move up the ladder of that participation to a place of dialogue where they will have equal information as adults, and also participate then to the partnership of actually, a young person has told me before, who actually participated in the consultation that the government organized, and said, well, they asked me a question, I answered back, but I'm not sure my answer made any difference because they still went and decided by themselves. I want to be there and actually hold my hand up and be like, okay, this is a tough decision that we made, but I also voted in this as such. So yeah, I think in order to get the systemic change that young people are asking, first of all, we need to move them up that participation ladder as such.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Valerie. Yes, Guy, you have a microphone there.
Yes,
it will come.
Yes. You hear me? Yeah. I see pluralistic participation. I love the word, but it does mean that also young people with other opinions who are not into this thing, are even against all those movements and don't believe it and very cynical, have their word. Also in youth work, you have youth work organizations who are not at all into the climate movement. How do you deal with them?
Well, I think the model, or the approach that they took of the controversial conversations offers a way forward in that respect. You know, the controversial conversation idea came about from within the consortium partners, you know, a divergence of views and perspectives, and recognizing that actually what we need to do, or what the steering group recognized what we need to do in this instance, is to take time for dialogue and open up the conversation, and I suppose learn how to conflict carefully. You know, learn how to share a divergent perspective, divergent perspectives with one another, and find a way forward through dialogue and deliberation. So there's no easy answer, but I think that's an approach that they sought to take.
I think so. I think in a way it's we have to also trust the youth work process, right? So youth work doesn't just get people in the room and then just be like, fend for yourself. We do have tools and methodologies that we use to disagree better, right? So it's about that. It's about creating a space where young people not necessarily have to disagree, but first of all can voice their opinion in certain issues. And of course there is like, and I think earlier on we were having the same sort of conversation at our table, where we were like, there is a base, why? We're not negotiating in terms of like human rights, or the basis in terms of like real core values, like of people's existence, people equality as such. So if that's our base, let's start a conversation from that. Of course, we'll all have different perspective, and I actually think it is naive to think that we can go about us continue in our society thinking that we cannot teach young people how to disagree better and still find a consensus, because there's just different opinion and existence that exists there. So it's about creating those skills. And the more we do it, the better we get at it, as such.
But you're from the Irish Youth Council,
yes.
So you give advices to government and to society. is in those advices, do you give place to other opinions, opinions who are not in favor of climate change and so on, and does it make them also less strong because they're divided?
Yeah, I mean, I can use an example of our latest consultation that we supported the energy company in Ireland to sort of do. So they have the biggest challenge they have right now is they have to get to 70% renewable energy. And so that's their target, and they're like, so how are we going to do this? They opened up a consultation for the whole of Ireland to us, and they came to us and asked us to collaborate with them in terms of like, how can we better capture, consult young people, because it wasn't enough to just put a survey out there and be like, let's have a conversation about this. But we invited all young people. And there were people that were there that actually really challenged the director in his view, and being like, but if he means that you're going to have to put wind power in the west of Ireland, and all of the energy has to go to Dublin, where Dublin is the one taking all of the energy, what about my community? And things like that. So it is possible to... We at the National Youth Council do invite young people to come with all of their views, but I think our role is not to shape or to tell young people what to think. Our role is to facilitate them to get to a place of understanding with all the facts that they have in front of them. So in preparation for a consultation like that, we asked the engineers to come along, to use language that is accessible to young people to explain. We asked the director of the organization to be present because it wasn't good enough that they will talk to just staff. We wanted the head, the person that will make the last decision, to hear from his, and he was fascinated to hear and was like to young people, some of the questions you've put forward today, I did not think about it. I'm gonna go away and think about it now. So our role is not to control young people, our role is to facilitate the better version or the better outcome that they think should be happening in society with all the facts that they get. And we have to make sure that the facts are correct and they're aligned, different viewpoints are present for people to understand.